Evening, everyone. My name is David, and I'd like to welcome you to this little panel talk where we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of CP Company ahead of its archive exhibition in Darwin. The retrospective will be showcasing the modern design language of CP Company and their dedication to fabric innovation, which have put them at the forefront of contemporary sportswear for the last 5 decades, not just in Italy, but also globally. And this evening works a little bit like a prelude to the exhibition, as we will be exploring the popularity of CP Company and its cultural relevance to the north of England. And I have a fine panel here with me to help shed some light on the past, present, and future aspects of the brand. Let me introduce them quickly. We have, on my left, Lorenzo Osti, who is the president of CP Company. We have Gary Aspden, who is designer and curator of adidas Spezial. We have Andrew Gross on my far right, who is the director of Westminster Menswear Archive, and a friend of the brand, Neil Munn. So I think it's only right and fair to start with Lorenzo, who not only have you traveled the furthest to be with us tonight, but you're also the son of CP Company founder Massimo. And today you're heading up the brand and carrying on your father's work. So I wonder, how do you describe CP Company? I mean, everyone in here is acutely aware of the brand, what it means and what it means to them personally. But how do you explain it to an outsider? What makes it different for you?
Well, you started with a very complicated question, but complex question, not complicated. I will try to answer it because actually I spent the last 6 months in thinking exactly about this because the reality is that CP Company is a complex brand. It is a deep brand. It has many things in it, and different people see different things in CP Company. So some of the people recognize in us and appreciate us for products, so the fabric innovation, the design. Some other for our history, our heritage. This year is 50. We celebrate the 50th anniversary. And some others, especially the younger generation, recognize us as a brand for the lens, for that. So this is what they see. So it's very difficult to give, let's say, a unique definition of CP Company. But I mean, it's fine. I don't think this complexity need to be simplified too much because it's actually its richness. But trying to answer it in today, that we don't have 2 hours to talk about it, I would like to focus on one aspect. I think CP has somehow the ability of creating an emotional connection with his audience, no? With the people who buys. It's a link on a personal level. I don't know if you experienced that, but people who wear CP Company actually really love CP. It's something that is not happening for every brand. It's not for the characteristic itself. It's something personal that come out. So I spent quite some thinking trying to understand what is the reason behind why this is happening and other brands doesn't have this. I think we're very lucky in that. And I see okay, it's a very strong simplification of a complex matter, but I think we can focus on 2 main aspects. The first is CP Company has a kind of evocational power. So it's able to bring something from some exotic place, some could be from the past, could be from something that don't belong to you. So yes, this kind of evocational power. Think about it, the Mille Miglia. I thought about it. It's an icon, but also if it became an icon, probably it's because there is a lot of the brand in that. And CP Company can remind you to, I don't know, old races, to nuvolare, but also, I don't know, the desert, this kind of protection, or to be kind of, I don't know, steampunk thing. I can't say exactly, but for sure there is some kind of evocation power in this garment, and I think this has helped to create this emotional connection. And the other aspect, maybe is even more relevant, but even more subtle and difficult to understand and explain, is that this brand and the people in this brand has kind of sensibility in understanding the contemporary world. So what's happening? What is let's say, in the belly of the people, or what is not told, and somehow put some of this in their work. So it's not something straightforward, and you see this and that, they're connected. It's very subtle, it's very personal, but this is around that. I won't get into too much deepness now, it's not the context, but it happened in several moments of the brand at the beginning, or is a real success in the early 2000s, and possibly it's happening again today, but I don't know why. It seems that the creative work in our team, they're able to interpret what is happening and put into the garment. So all this make the brand able to connect on a personal level, and I think this is the traits of CP. This is how I will define CP. It's not about an aesthetic or a look. If you see, the look can change a lot. In 50 years, it has changed a lot, but this spirit is always there.
But it's reactionary then, that it reacts to what's going on around it.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, we can say yes, this.
So clearly CP Company is a global brand, but we're here talking about England as a very specific geographical area. Do you know if yourself or Massimo or the brand in general, how were you surprised when you, how deep the roots ran in the UK quickly?
Absolutely, very surprised. And I must be very honest, I mean, we knew nothing about that at that time because my father was an English speaking and actually didn't really love to travel. And then his work was pretty much in his office, in his, let's say, ivory tower, as some you can say. He explicitly said, I don't want to be influenced too much about what's going on. And so he was there. And there was no internet, there was no possibility to see images around. So what we had sales data, and we have our partner here in the UK, and what we knew, I know it's not nice to say, but it's a very simplistic, but the information we had at that time, CP Company and other brand my father designed at that time, became popular within the hooligans community. That was the only information I had. And then what happened? My father passed away. I found the archive with my sister, and internet arrived, and Facebook, and I start getting in touch with these people, and I understand it was totally another thing. It was really a cultural thing. It was something much more deeper, much more interesting, and much more personal again. And I start to see people selling T-shirts with my father's face, and maybe it's normal for you, but believe me, in Italy, nobody knows about my father outside of the industry. So seeing the T-shirt or the phone cover or the pin, was like, what's that? And I start talking with the people and meet a lot of them. And I get in love. And then I met Gary, and I went to Darwin. First time I went to the north is like 3 years ago, and I was shocked. I mean, to me, looks like being in an advertising set for CP. Everybody was wearing CP. And I told him, but okay, it's all organized. I said, no, it's normal. So it was a big surprise, yeah, to make it short. And just want to add, I'm extremely grateful for that, because honestly, the brand suffered in its lifetime a lot of up and down, change of direction. But if we are here today, honestly, and this is not just to please the people here, it's because I believe it, is thanks to that community, because they never dropped us and allowed to pass through the darker moments. And so this is the reason why we want to celebrate in the North with the 50th anniversary.
Gary, I'm wondering, cultural moments like this is often a magical mix of product combined with the time and a place. And we know the product and we know the place, but what about the timings? When would you say sort of the major breakthrough for CP came to the North?
Oh, it depends how you define major, really. I mean, I know when it first began appearing, growing up in the 1980s, there were a group of guys who were like a generation older than me from Blackburn who would regularly go to Austria and Switzerland, finding trainers and clothing and procuring those with the entrepreneurial spirit that came from Mrs. Thatcher's government. So yeah, they went over there thieving basically and stealing clothes. And so I remember one guy who I knew. You'd go around to his flat, and they started to wear like iceberg history in 1986, 87. And you'd go to a Blackburn Rovers match, and there'd be all these guys there with like cartoons all over their knitwear. And you'd be like, what, how come they're wearing icebergs? One, because it wasn't available in the UK, and two, because it was really expensive. So that became a thing for them. And not long after that, a guy called Des from Blackburn, who was notoriously made many, many trips abroad, appeared in a Millie jacket with the goggles, and it was like one of those, what is that moments. And
you remember that, seeing that?
Yeah, and there were a lot of those moments through the 80s and that whole early era of, people call it football casuals, but essentially it was working class fashion. And the first time you saw somebody wearing a salmon pink Lacoste t-shirt, it's like, wow, he's wearing pink, that's a girl's colour. Those moments kind of really stick with you. And so seeing the Millie for the first time, it's like, what's going on with that hood? What is that? And Des was always one of those guys who was, he was always at the forefront of wearing those things that nobody else dared to wear.
But on that timeline then, the first time you saw the goggle jacket, like you just said, what we're talking, and late 80s? Or?
About 89, it would have been 88, 89, I'm guessing. I remember getting the sweatshirt with 989, so that's how I know I can date it, because I bought a sweatshirt from one of these guys that was going over to Switzerland and Austria, and it was a CP sweatshirt, and it said 989, and I always remember that sweatshirt. And being somebody who was a big fan of Factory Records and Peter Saville's work, I love that idea of reduction and the idea that you can drop the one because it's not necessary. There's something really modernist about that and really intelligent about that. So that was, and you get the kind of, there's probably people watching this who are football fans from other clubs going, well, we were onto it in whatever year, but that's when it happened in Blackburn. That's when it began to happen. And what's really interesting is the way that it has kind of developed and progressed over time. Because, I went to watch Blackburn Rovers on Tuesday night playing Hull at Ewood Park, and there's about 15, 20 of us that sit together who've all been, around and into CP companies since back then. But then there's a whole new generation of teenage kids who are obsessed with CP up there. My girlfriend's son, he's 18 years old, and he can't believe that CP company are coming to Darwin. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. He is like, but they're not kind of like looking at me and my mates that go watching Blackburn Rovers and taking fashion direction from us. No. Their music taste is quite different to ours. A lot of them they're really into like fitness. They're into going to the gym. They're into techno, but at the same time, they're also into kind of guitar music as well. It's a different generation, but it's a kind of similar mindset. It's that whole thing of like clean living under difficult conditions.
We'll get a little bit later on to CP in the north today, but I just wanted to bring in Andrew as well, and you alluded to this, Gary, but if we look at northern parts of England at this time, was there what was going on culturally? Was there a social movement? Was there a music scene that you think that CP just sort of absorbed and or fitted into naturally?
I think it's because in the 70s, when CP started, we were seeing the death of the industrialization that had happened in the north. From the Industrial Revolution to the 19th century, suddenly there was mass unemployment and those jobs were going. And so all those jobs where maybe you were proud of what you wore to work because you were given a uniform working on the railways or a boiler fitter or on any of those jobs were disappearing. At the same time, Massimo was looking at those garments and being really inspired about the heroic roles these men had. So I think fashion, if you think about fashion, particularly women's wear, is always about creating iconoclastic moments of newness, whereas Massimo was actually about investigating what already existed and reinterpreting it and making it relevant for that moment in time. And I think it's interesting, that thing that happened in Britain that time when mod went to hard mod, and then on the football terraces, you know, it was all about selling boots and working class clothes. There's this moment where David Bowie's wearing this duffel coat on the cover of the Low album, and suddenly the most subversive thing for David Bowie had been, you know, Ziggy Stardust a couple of years before, is the duffel coat, this piece of, on one level, very ordinary menswear that is functional. Suddenly the most radical, transgressive thing you could do is think about normality and slightly twist that. And I think this is the thing that happened with the origins of, you know, football casuals and dresses and all that, is about how can we subvert that language. And then there's also a connection, I think, with Italy, is the grand tour of Italy that, you know, people used to go over to Italy to enjoy the culture. Like Gary said, this was happening again, but it was the working class that were pilfering the culture and bringing it back and owning it. So I think there's also that class thing about we understand good design, good taste, and we want a part of that, regardless of, you know, how we're doing financially. So I think it resonates on all sorts of levels about why CP Company really spoke to people at that particular moment. I think that's just continued.
One thing I'd say to that as well, I read an article about the making of The Man Who Fell to Earth, where that Bowie image came from. And the stylist was the guy from Guns N' Roses, Slash. It was his mum who styled that. And Nicholas Roeg said he wanted to make Bowie look as British as possible. And so that look was a very British look. And this is a very British subculture that we're talking about. It's like you say, there's something very subversive about it. It's almost like it's the mentality of mod coupled with the attitude of punk. And so it's taking things that are almost like not meant for us and reworking that and changing the context of it. And it's all about adoption. Anyway.
Well, in many ways, it's about reacting, isn't it? Like, it's looking at something, reacting to that, and pulling things from different aspects of cultures and creating your own, I suppose, which, you know, perhaps works with what you were saying earlier on about CP being a reactive brand.
Some practicality about CP as well. It's like if you were on the football terraces in the late 70s, 80s, early 90s, these were not like stadia are nowadays. So actually, you needed a really good coat to keep you warm and keep you dry. So there was a practical element to it. But picking up on Lorenzo's first point, to me, CP resonates with people because you get an emotional response. You had never seen jackets, like all these kind of jackets you see in the frames there, these kind of things with the goggles. Nothing like that had ever appeared in the UK. So you had something that looked like it had come from outer space, and you had jackets which were in colours that you had never seen. You know, even nowadays, the UK is traditionally a very kind of dark palette, shall we say, in terms of what people tend to buy. But all of a sudden you had, you know, tonal colours, you had bright colours, you had earth, tinto, dyeing kind of treatments. Orange, indeed. And so, you know, those things just stood out and made you think, what is that? You know, so you had that emotional reaction to seeing something you'd never seen before. Then there was a kind of usually a shock point where you looked at the price tag and thought, really? Which body part can I afford to lose in order to try and buy this kind of thing?
Which planet is coming from?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's like there must be a typo here or something. But CP and some of its sister brands, of course, Osti brands, is one of few, I think, global menswear brands that inspires a sort of religious devotion to it. So only Levi's and Vivienne Westwood can I think of in menswear that have any kind of following that is as zealous and as committed and devoted as people who are into things like CP.
Right. And Neil, you're also, from the south or from London?
So I'm not a child of the north. No, I'd have to admit that. Yeah.
No, that's fine.
I have lived in the north.
Yeah. Neither am I, so that's all good. But I was just wondering, like, we talk a lot about Northern England. So if you then, as a southerner, if you like, if you look at, at that time we're talking about, personally, were you aware of CP, or did you sort of see it as a brand that came into Northern England first and then came down to you, or?
I would find it very difficult to tell you where it first appeared.
Right.
I mean, I was a football fan who went up and down the country. I've lived all around the country. And certainly, the first time I saw maybe CP sort of with the Mealy type jacket, I would say was probably in somewhere like Leeds, in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. But in terms of seeing it in a store as such, it would have been in London, definitely.
What about when you were going to games?
Yeah, sure. You would, sometimes part of the fun of going to away games was to try and find, whatever the local stockists were, and see what different things they had. Because, of course, we didn't have Instagram, internet, full-on global exposure of everything existed. You didn't know. You had to find out by word of mouth, or you had to go around and see places, or look at other people, or word of mouth.
You actually had to work for it.
You had to. You absolutely did, and that was part, I think, of building up. Certainly, my generation. I think that's part of that devotion as well, because it was sort of like a treasure hunt type thing, and then, finding something that you'd never seen before, in a different part of the country. Was
so you went to a game, you saw the terraces, it was like looking at a gallery, and you saw the clothes you liked, and then you spent a week hunting them down.
Probably longer, because it wasn't that easy. You had to wait for like a copy of the Face or Arena to get an advert that showed you where the stockists were in the country.
Yeah.
And then we had to get on the phone and talk to people. It's like,
it's funny,
I think younger generations, you're spoilt beyond belief. You don't realise how easy it is. It's like
you mentioned the Face. At that time, like had the magazines, or rather, when did those kind of magazines pick up on this as a genuine sort of culture?
So there's a iconic article in the Face, isn't there? Kevin Sampson's article, I think, which is about the rise of casual. But I can't remember the exact date. Is it around it must be around 83-ish, something like that.
Yeah. Is that the Kevin Sampson article?
Yeah.
The one with the kids?
Yeah, the kids in the Lacoste, the one in the park.
The new order cover.
Right. So that's what, so it's sort of that time where it starts to appear. But I think it's probably early 90s to mid 90s before it becomes quite established in terms of, you can actually see it fairly regularly. Before then, it tended to be the odd person that had got it, from my perspective of it.
The stuff from the early 80s, though, looks really naive in comparison to when we're talking about these products that we've got here and the standard of design. Like in the early 80s, like that article that was in the Face, it was kind of very young kids with kind of V-neck sweaters and polo shirts. What happens in the late 80s when CP and when Lorenzo's father's designs start appearing is design goes to a whole different level, really. And it's really interesting hearing Lorenzo's perspective on it, in so much as his father wasn't being driven by what the consumer wanted. He was being driven by his own vision. And it's almost like, you put these products out into the world and culture takes them and embraces them, recontextualizes them, and makes them into something completely different. Exactly the same as with Adidas trainers. We're talking about David Bowie. His press shots around that time, he was wearing Stan Smiths, which was a radical thing to do in 1976, to wear athletic footwear in the context of kind of everyday life, with chinos and a shirt and a tie. And so, when we were buying trainers, it was the same thing. You were going to sports shops that were selling fishing tackle and air rifles. Do you know what I mean? It was, and taking these things and making them your own. And that's what's so kind of subversive about it, is that when you talk about the price point of these jackets and stockists, you know, my first CP stockist was kind of guys I knew's attic. You know, you'd go around to their house, or, you know, someone would turn up in the local pub with a bag full of trainers and jackets and sweatshirts. That was how it was. But, you know, and in some ways, you know, brands would like to kick that sort of story into the long grass, but that's the reality, you know. And so, yeah, I think, Coach, it's very interesting that, you know, this stuff wasn't targeted. It was all about product. Make good products, you know, build it, and they will come. You know.
The other point I'd make about firstly, you had the wow factor. What is this thing? But the other thing was, as I think Gary's alluding to there, is the sophistication of the garments that are produced as well. So they look casual, but yet, if you look at them closely, the elegance and the quality in them is outstanding. And again, was like nothing else you had probably seen.
Well, I was kind of wondering that. It's like, because obviously, you know, CP is a very technical brand, and there are plenty of technical sort of outerwear brands out there, but I wonder how much that was, you know, in those days was sort of a USP, you know, was it more cultural currency?
I mean, it was product, but it was everything that came with the product as well, you know. Like, his father had come from a graphic design background, and, you know, like, I remember doing my finals for, you know, I went back to college as a mature student, but in the late 90s, borrowing a load of CP catalogues when I was putting together my final presentation, and the catalogues from the early 90s, these large format catalogues with these amazing photographs of the jackets kind of in there. It was just like, yeah, it was a whole package, you know, and it felt so Italian, which made it really exotic to kids who were growing up in a rainy northern hill town in what was, you know, a recession. It's
so weird that Massimo and yourself didn't know any of this, that you just carried on doing your thing.
Absolutely. No, in fact, it's really interesting for me because I lack, knowledge about the Northern culture. Of course, I know something, I read what I can, but I mean, nobody, I can know as much as you do. So it really made me click one thing that you said before, because you're right. First of all, my father was just creating a product the best he can, regarding the price tag. This was a frequent conversation, because my father was really disappointed by the price point he creates, because he said, we always used to say, okay, creating fantastic, super expensive products is easy. You just take the best that is around and you make it. But the challenge is to make great product at a good price. But at the end of the day, he was always pissed off, because he said, I can't just use a shitty fabric. I really can't. So at the end of the day, he was always complaining that the garments were too expensive, but he was never been able to really put them down. And another thing, so what clicked to me, because there is all this concept about the relevance, no, that is really central for CP, but for many brands. And I'm thinking a lot, what actually make things relevant to the people? What did that click? And then I identified a couple of moments in the CP history at the early beginning, in the 70s in Italy, and again, as I said before, around the year 2000. But I really missed, I have no clue what bring the people from UK, the northern people, to adopt this brand. You told me about it's coming from another world. That was, is a confirmation of what I was saying before. It's kind of an evocative power, no? It's brings something from somewhere else. But you said something that I never thought about. It's very simple, but it's very clever. It's all working class, okay? And my father was obsessed by working clothing and military for this functionality, no? Because he loved the fact that it was very essential, no fancy, really just for doing something. Maybe that was something that helped this product resonate with the people, because they were used to this kind of language, visual language of functionality, and they refound it at the same time in a let's say, what's the English word? in a very different way, because the color, the shape, the design, with this evocation together. Okay, I'm missing the word I'm trying to, sorry, it's a while I don't practice English. But anyway, possibly this has been the click. Why people from the north get this personal connection to this garment? Because I think it's something really subtle that you cannot explain with rational thinking. Is very emotional, and maybe it's that. Maybe it's that.
I also think it's about product. You know, it's an amazing product. And I think fashion brands are so used to. If you think about the history of fashion, women's wear, you know, from Charles Frederick Worth onwards, it's about elevating the designer and them, and pictures of them and the runways, them having a bow at the end. And that isn't what CP's been about. It's been about the product. And you discover the product, either someone wearing it and it's someone you think they look great in it, or you see it in the shop and you go, what is this object? I don't understand it. And so I think you then enter into that personal relationship with the object, not the brand, and it's through that object you then discover that there's all these other parts to the brand.
Exactly. Let me add something. You're totally right. I mean, I'm not an expert of history of fashion, but I think CP was one of the first brand that really focused only on the products. What happened? Usually brands were used to represent a word, no? That you want to aspire to or whatever, so a nice picture, posed model, whatever. They offer you a model you can adhere. But if you talk about the products, you're not offering a model, you have to find your own. So this is possibly why some subculture, some culture, they found something organically, and they make this connection their own. And this can happen that the same garments appeal to the let's say, left-handed intellectual of the 70s in Bologna, or the paninari in the 80s, this is totally in other words, or the working class in North England in the 90s. So it's very interesting, yeah.
So the CP Company magazine, I mean, you know, that was the first time I think I can ever remember seeing any sort of clothing brand that represented, well, first the idea that actually published a magazine, you know, was astonishing.
They were on sale.
On sale on the newsagent.
In the newspaper stand.
In Italy. Yeah.
€5, £5 or 5 lira.
And like it had a circulation of like
you have to buy too.
40,000 or something, didn't it, at one point?
No, 40,000 copies, yeah.
So imagine that, as you know, the idea that a fashion brand could have its own magazine that would sell at that sort of numbers. But also those pictures, which I think were taken by your mother, was only of the garment. You didn't have models staged and a lifestyle sort of aspirational picture. It was purely a picture of the garment, and it was either very focused in on a particular detail, or it was at a strange angle or something, you know. But it made you stop and look at it. And again, you're developing that emotional connection with that brand, perhaps subconsciously, but you know, over time, when you get that connection with it, you're bound to be that much more interested in the product and in the story behind that brand. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly more style-focused than trend-driven. I suppose maybe, I don't know, Andrew, would you agree? I mean, these are the kind of qualities, I suppose, that...
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing, and I only thought this today, you know, you have one of those moments, I was thinking, oh, it's 50 years. I'm reading this book about time in fashion, and how we're living in this mechanized industrial time, because, you know, in the 19th century, when time becomes ratified across the world and procedures are manufactured, then ratify, and we go into the seasons of autumn, winter, spring, summer. I just thought, but, you know, Osti's way of designing and then how that's developed is the continuity of garments that come back and are repeated and revisited. So there isn't this linear time. It's like this time's both compressed and expanded at the same time. And then Gary was saying, you know, garments came with the date on them. So suddenly this object, I looked at a coat I was going to wear earlier and I thought, oh, actually, what year is this from? Is this from 89, 93? I had to look, oh, there's the answer, because it could have been from any of those periods.
They look timeless.
And they look timeless.
And they look contemporary even now.
But also I suddenly was struck by the watch view and thinking, this is actually, you see time by looking through the garment. So the garment and that idea of how we envisage time. Fashion's always telling you about the next thing, the new thing, and get rid of last season. This is constantly making you rethink how you think about fashion and time And probably most of the people in this audience, I was saying to Lorenzo, are wearing jackets that might be 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years old. No other fashion brand would people have that reaction. If you went to a fashion show at Fashion Week, people would be wearing that season because they want to show they've got that season's thing. Within CP, all of those things exist at the same moment, and all of them are really valid and exciting.
But also, it sat outside of the fashion circus. The whole catwalk, runway, Zoolander world. It didn't kind of get mixed up in any of that. It was its own thing. It had a strong vision, and it stuck to that vision. And that vision, we're talking a lot about Lorenzo's father's work because that obviously laid the foundations. But there's been lots of other people who have taken his vision and moved it into new areas and to where CP is going, where it is now. I mean, there's been some, it's almost like he created a template.
Yeah.
And that was a very modern idea to sort of, and again, kind of subversive in its own way, because it's like, I'm not going to play the Milan Fashion Week game. I'm going to stay in Bologna, and I'm going to make, and I'm going to stick with my vision, and I'm going to keep making these products. Yeah. And I'm going to look at purpose in products. So in the way that I'm looking at workwear and sportswear, well, there's this driving race that takes place near me. What would you do if you were to make a jacket for that? Which elements would you add to a jacket? So you can, but he created a template that sat outside of that whole kind of superfluous, sort of shallow, well, I'm calling it shallow, some people are probably offended by that. But, that kind of, that sort of like, oh, what are we going to be this season? Oh, this season it's hippie. Oh, next season it's punk.
Very transitory.
It's like, it's kind of, it didn't try and, it wasn't like a cultural tourist. It was just making...
And Lorenzo, was that intentionally? Was that intention sort of, laid out by your father and yourself to sort of stay out of that? Or can you actually think of a moment where you were maybe sort of flirting, if you like, with fashion and maybe pulled away or wanted to be included?
No, my father was totally anti-fashion and was a very reserved and somehow shy person. And he really liked, real people and the true things, not all this, circus, as you mentioned, perfect definition. So he always stayed away. And in a certain moment in his time, he told me he possibly have made a mistake because he was invited to move to Milan. Consider that we were living in Bologna, and there was probably the only case of someone working in fashion not living in Milan, where everything was happening, all the PR and whatever. So at a certain point in his time, he said, maybe I should have moved to Milan when I was asked, but I believe that staying in his office in Bologna allowed him to stay away from all this and not became similar to all the rest. But I have a question myself, sorry, because I'm very interested about this. You mentioned before the change of generation, so the new generation adopting CP company. I'm trying to think a lot about that and understanding what resonates today with the youngest generation that, of course, is more difficult to understand to me. I want to ask if you have any clue about it, or if you think that how this can have passed. Can this have happened as a generation transmission? So they discover from their parents, and then they start buying. Because what surprised me is that it's pretty parallel, the success of the brand in the youngest generation and also the second-hand market toward the same target.
Well, I think what's really interesting is, if you talk about, I don't really like the word casual culture, but if you say that culture, it's the only subculture that hasn't ossified, that is continuously being reinvented and revisited. And the reason for that, I think, is because it's every Saturday, there's 20,000 people going to some other town in England, and people are looking at what they're wearing and judging them by what they're wearing. So, it's not like Derby take 40,000 Goths to Darwin, do you know what I mean? So I think Gary's looking at those people, you're seeing the young ones thinking about how they're wearing, what they're wearing, and I think that's where that's happening, those dialogue between different men about who's wearing what and the cues are coming there. They're not coming from fashion magazines because it doesn't speak to that language. It's actually about what people wear and how they interpret it.
But it's not, you know, the thing is, it's not solely about football. It really isn't, you know, like most of the best dressed guys in the 80s when I was growing up, these guys that were going to Switzerland, they didn't go to football matches. They were thieves. They were into making money. So, like, they had amazing clothes and they would sell clothes to football fans. And they might have had a passing interest in football, but it wasn't this, you know, and I think sometimes things get made very simplistic and things get pigeonholed, you know. It's like, oh, they're working class, therefore they're this kind of 90s idea of lad or laddism. And, you know, I mean, Ben Banks said it to me once, and it was a very succinct thing that he said to me, and it stuck with me. And he said, you know, these working class guys are incredibly sophisticated in their taste, in the clothes that they're buying. You know, and this idea that of laddism, that completely goes in the face of that, really. You know, their attention to detail with product, and they know product, and it's you know, this idea that it's this kind of moronic laddism idea that gets kind of splashed around. There's so much more to it than that. It's a very, very sophisticated audience that we're talking about. They may be coming from post-industrial, economically deprived areas, but when it comes to product, they know what they're talking about. Whereas, you know, there's a certain amount of objectivity that comes with them as well, which you don't necessarily get with the catwalk fashion circus, who are just kind of like, whatever that designer says is happening must be great. There's a certain amount of objectivity and critique, which is, no, I'm not really into that. And, you know, but they're very brand loyal as well. If they find a brand that they love, they're loyal to it. And what's really interesting with CP is the way that it's kind of morphed as it's into something more than what it was. Because, yeah, I see loads of guys at football wearing CP, but a lot of the kids that I'm seeing wearing CP up in Lancashire, they're not football fans. They don't go to football, but they wear lots and lots of CP company, as Lorenzo witnessed.
What about music then, as a sort of, you know, a gateway, if you like, to CP? But like, you know, because it's so easy to talk about football as oh yeah, that's at the games, that's where you saw the jackets and, you know, you wore them on the terraces to impress the guy next to you. But, you know, that time you talked about before, you know, like, I suppose if you weren't going to games, you were going to gigs or clubs, right? Like that was a big reason for meeting you, you know, gathering, and was that like also a sort of a, you know, not a catwalk, but obviously like a place to show off your coats? Yeah,
I mean, in the 80s, that era that we're talking about, the street fashion, if we can call it that, like this British street fashion, this British subculture, it was not, yes, everybody was into music, but people were not taking their fashion direction from the people that were on stage. So that's where it's kind of different. That's where it's only when you get to the 90s when you start to see things like trainers embraced by the mainstream. I remember I studied fashion. I lasted about 6 months actually before I dropped out because I spent more time in the Aspden than I spent in college. But I went to study fashion at Manchester Poly in 1988. And I was doing fashion design then. My degree eventually was in fashion promotion, but I was studying fashion design. And my fashion illustrations, I used to put trainers on my fashion illustrations, and my lecturers thought I was from another planet. Mm-hmm. And I was designing, and that's only 1988, and which probably seems a lifetime away if you're in your 20s or a teenage. But you know, you know, at that time, it wasn't. You know, the only people that were wearing trainers and sportswear and casual wear were kind of, you know, football casuals and hip hop kids, really. Mm. You know, and when I saw the Millie for the first time, that was a time when acid house was happening, and there were lots of people who were wearing kind of, you know, a lot of people made a lot of fashion mistakes around that kind of early rave kind of thing that happened. But, you know, seeing that guy Des in the goggle jacket was like, you know, like I say, it was just one of those moments. It cut through all the kind of smiley faces and dungarees and kind of, you know, and all that kind of madness that was, you know, the day glow stuff that was going on around that time. You know, it just cut through all that because it was pure.
Yeah.
If you come back to Lorenzo's question though about why the next generation's interested in it, I think it's a good clue if you look at these terrific frames that are around the room here. You know, these jackets still look like nothing else. And so, you know, young interested kids, I mean, kids are presumably much more interested in fashion and how they look, and you know, than even previous generations were because of all the social media and influencing and Instagram and that sort of thing that they get involved in on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, something like that just still, I think, stands out in the marketplace compared to everyone else.
I'd also add in, because we started the Westminster Menswear Archive in 2016, so it's open to students in industry, and everyone from industry goes to the CP company. Yeah. I can't tell you, it's like, because they understand where the design is and the quality of make and the conceptual thinking, the genesis and the conceptual thinking that goes into that. And it's quite interesting, some brands come in and they just don't even want to look at their own history. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and it's not because they know it, because they
That was interesting.
There's such a level of quality in the product design that when you look at any of those things, that you want to understand them and think about the materiality and the processes and the dyeing and the print and all the things that have gone in to make that object something worthy of study. And you just don't find that with many menswear brands, you really don't.
When you, if you mentally picture the archive, and can you pick out one or two CP pieces from there that you think, you know, for you, sort of summarize the brand?
I mean, it depends, because it's like, what are your favourite children in a way, isn't it? It's sometimes those really early pieces from 82, 83, where there's those jacquard knits that are suddenly being used with nylons and leather, so the combination of fabric together shouldn't work, but it does work. Or the proportions of something you might understand as the jacket have been played with, so things are bigger. Obviously, you probably know how obsessed I am about the urban protection range, because I think that's a moment where CP radically takes itself in a different direction and proposes something so different at a moment that it's got a bravery to it. And that's something that it keeps on doing after that moment, that it's allowing itself to say, we've got this history, but also we can subvert that history and do it in different ways. So I think...
So, and UP reflects a moment in time for where, you know, people gravitate from the provinces to the urban environment. Yeah? And so, you know, if you don't know CP particularly, and you see something from UP and you see something from pre that, you'd think, how on earth can these be related? They're so different.
Totally different.
And yet, actually, the DNA of them is exactly the same.
But when I spoke to Moreno and I asked him why you came up with that, and actually it's been a very highlighted conversation, because he told me, okay, I didn't went after the CP company aesthetics. That up to that point has been pretty consistent. Came from my father for a long time, and then a small part from Romeo Gigli. But I said, I try to get back to the principle of the brand. So in his opinion, and I made his thoughts, my thoughts, because I believe it's been very correct, is that CP Company has been a very contemporary brand, able to understand and put in their products something that is in the belly of the society. And in that specific time, there were, ahead of the year 2000, if you remember, there was the millennium bug, this idea of the new millennium, what would be. It's a bit scaring, but it's fascinating. And it came out with something that would protect for this threat. So it was perfectly resonating with the content. And he understood the contemporary and has been successful. And a similarity happened in the early beginning with all the destructuration and the washing and the idea of bringing like garments that look used when nobody was doing that. But I think something is happening again now. But I still don't get it. I mean, maybe in a few years' time, looking back, it's easier, of course, no?
No, time lends you the benefit of hindsight, obviously.
Yeah. And well, I don't want to go off topic, and I'm sorry if, Andrew, if I look a bit naive. I'm not a professor, but I do my own thinking, and and it's connected to what you said before about the quality of the products. I think that today's generation is back on product that has a content, that has something to say, because they are back in expressing their own identity through the garments. And I think this has not been happening for almost 10 years in the past, where the contemporary arrival of the fast fashion that allow anybody to dress well without too much research, and the rise of the technology that became a status symbol. In that period, the value of this garment was less relevant to them, in my opinion. And again, then technology became a commodity. The fast fashion is there, but that is, is there since a while. And I think the young generation is looking again in expressing themselves in garments, something that they have to have a meaning to them, so have a content, and look back about the history, the quality, the research, and all that you mentioned before.
But Andrew, you work with students, you deal with younger people every single day. I mean, do they, when they look at CP as a brand, do they care about the past? Do they care about those 5 decades of
I suppose why we built an archive, so you'd say to students, why don't you go down and look at the shop because there's this great jacket in, and you were reliant on them going there and looking at the right jacket and taking photos, and some shops don't like you doing that. And also you're only then looking at that season's jacket that was the buy of that shop. And actually, having all these garments, and we sort of borrowed the idea of the archive from Massimo, because we've got we call them cloth-based objects, because there's designer objects and there's also key garments that are military industrial, and actually they're all valued at the same level. And the materiality of those garments to study is amazing, because they might look and say, how have they done this print or this finish, or what's this material next to this material, or how have they been constructed? Some things have got no lining to them. So they're a wealth.
You're on their inquisitiveness, aren't you, to explore and then come up with a...
Well, and also, like Massimo did, you're learning from the best. You're understanding other people's iterations of objects, and then your design comes from thinking about the materiality, and how you slightly change that and move that into somewhere else. And I think that's why they continue to resonate, because they are telling you stories about objects that have existed way before Massimo Osti existed, and now way past the people who are designing enough stuff now. That's why I think 50 years, but it could easily be 100 years, because it set that blueprint, like Gary said, that the new designers can come in and have a voice within that and add to that.
And lastly, I just want to know, I've been hearing some rumors about a potential project, perhaps, between you two.
Nothing about it.
Can I deny or confirm?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're doing a project together. It's actually a long time we want to do this. And it's happening. I'm very happy. So it will be a collaboration between adidas, Spezial, and CP Company, releasing this autumn. And we won't tell you too many details. But no, I'm very proud. I'm very happy. I mean, it's really what is 2 or 3 years we're talking, and we'd love to do something together.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it was born out of Lorenzo and Enrico and the team coming to Darwin. That's where it all starts. I was contacted about whether I would, because we'd got to know each other through mutual friends at 4 Marketing, and Lorenzo was aware of what I was doing, and then they were doing the Eyes on the City series, and so it was like, we want a creative person from these different cities. So they asked me if I would be interested in doing it for London, and I was very flattered. But I also said it wouldn't be the truth about CP Company for me if it was all about me working in the creative industries in London, because my connection with the brand starts with Lancashire. So if you're happy to film me in London and Lancashire, then I'm agreeable to doing it. And they were like, great, let's do it. So they came up to Lancashire, and as I say, they witnessed the popularity of the brand in that part of the world. And like I say, they were like, is this for real? You know, because it wasn't just a bunch of kind of middle-aged guys harking on about how great things were in the 80s. It was 15, 16-year-old kids as well. So it was, I think that left, I mean, I'm not speaking for you, but I think that left an impression on you for sure. And so that was, you know, the idea of doing the exhibition. They mentioned to me about, you know, we were doing the collaboration anyway, and then they mentioned to me that for the 50th anniversary they were thinking about, I think it was Hong Kong, Milan and London. And I was saying, well, we have the British Textile Biennial up in Lancashire, and, you know, I understand why you would want to do something in London because most brands do. But at the same time, I think there's something, you know, more interesting about taking it into like a heartland of, you know, like I say, an economically deprived area. And I'd like to say, you know, because back home people are going, how did you convince them to do that? And I'm like, I'm like, they didn't take any convincing because they'd been here and they understood.
Yeah.
And so they were enthusiastic about the idea immediately. So it seems like the perfect place to reveal the product that we've made together.
Well, that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and we will see the results hopefully soon. I think that's all we have time for, so I want to thank my panel for coming on and answering my questions, and to all of you for showing up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.